Non, rien de rien. Non, je ne regrette rien. Ni le bien comme on fait.
3.5 years ago, the world was shocked when the managing director or big boss of the International Monetary Fund, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, also then seriously being touted as a French presidential candidate, was arrested in his hotel in New York, taken by the police to a New York precinct and charged with rape. He had been accused of raping a maid in the hotel. The maid refused to withdraw the charges. At that time, many of us felt that whether or not Strauss-Kahn was guilty, he later settled out of court. The IMF was certainly guilty of raping countries and continents, and that it was symbolic that its boss was being charged with a crime which the institution committed every single day in different continents and in different countries. So what is the IMF? Ever since its foundation in 1944 at Bretton Woods, together with the World Bank, it has been one of the key financial institutions of the United States empire. Its role has always been controversial because its policy prescriptions are tied with an umbilical cord made of piano wire to the US Treasury and its European allies. In the early days, the International Monetary Fund carried out policies approved by the United States. The big challenge then came from socialism, the idea of a planned economy, and the IMF and the World Bank promoted development. That is, countries were encouraged to industrialize a tiny bit, to build themselves as a rival to the alternative approach that was coming from Moscow and Beijing. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Western approach to market liberalization, privatization, austerity, free trade, which it thought had produced massive growth in the developed countries, especially, of course, the United States of America itself, could be sent via the international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, to the rest of the world. Of course, what they missed out was that Washington itself would soon, in the late 60s and 70s, be subjected to a growing crisis within its own economy. And so it would no longer be capable of sending US investments out, but instead would become a magnet to encourage investments from other parts of the world, i.e., foreign investments for those countries in the United States to try and revive its economy. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 80s, early 90s, the political formula and the economic formula worked in tandem. The strategy that was developed, which has been known as the Washington Consensus, as summarized by the World Bank itself, had 10 basic points. These constituted what is in reality the charter of market fundamentalism. Strong fiscal discipline, i.e., massive reduction in government spending. Redirection of public spending towards education, health, and infrastructure. Tax reform, i.e., broadening the tax base so the poor paid more, and cutting tax rates essentially for the rich. Market-determined interest rates, competitive exchange rates, trade liberalization, that is, eliminating quotas and tariffs, i.e. reducing the economic sovereignty of large parts of the world, and then, of course, opening up these countries to foreign direct investment, privatizing state enterprises like railways, like health, etc., deregulation on a large scale. And what this meant effectively was that countries began to suffer and people began to get more and more upset. Politicians who'd made their names by opposing these policies suddenly committed a big change around and began to implement them. And the result effectively was disastrous. Let's talk about Africa. This was a continent which had always had a shortage of labor. Many reasons for this. One, the population of Africa as a continent was always very low, given the size of the continent, compared to, say, for instance, Asia. The reasons for this were varied. One was the large number of people who had been taken out of the continent during the decades of slavery, which had completely wrecked the population patterns already low. So that the early changes that took place in Africa, most African countries after independence, were not so different to changes taking place in other parts of the world. With this big difference, that whereas the United States gave a lot of help and money to countries on the borders of China, like Japan, like South Korea, like Taiwan, they were allowed to do anything, Africa was more or less starved. And this developed into a huge crisis in sub-Saharan Africa when natural disasters struck. Now, there were two problems here. One, the policies being promoted at that time by the World Bank and the IMF did not help to alleviate the growing poverty in that continent, even in the early days of development. The second factor, which cannot be abstracted from the situation, is that local elites, politicians, bankers, business people collaborated fully with the international financial institutions, and they got rich themselves, their families got rich. And a related problem was the fact that one of the keys to success in Africa was to de-tribalize the countryside. As African specialists like Mahmoud Mamdani have long argued, concentrating simply in the urban areas concentrated wealth in the hands of very few and left the countryside effectively tribalized so it could be ruled better by the elites, as it had been prior to them by various empires, essentially the British Empire, but also the French and the Germans for a certain period. So there were lots of consequences for Africa, which were the result of many things. The IMF entry into the continent in the 80s and 90s basically destroyed the social infrastructure of many African countries. Viruses, diseases, later famines led to a large growth in migration, people trying to get out of these countries. This was followed by wars. And in these crises, not having a social infrastructure makes things worse, not better. But Africa is a complicated and complex story. If we move from that continent to something that is more recent and clear, then we can see what happened in Latin America. If you look at two key developments in South America, one Venezuela and the second Argentina, in both of these, the International Monetary Fund and local elites were heavily involved. Let us start with the famous Caracazo that erupted in Caracas and its suburbs. The Caracazo was the huge uprising of the poor, against the demands of the IMF, the so-called Structural Adjustment Program, promising the government $4.5 billion in loans, provided they carried out the measures being insisted on by the International Monetary Fund. What were these measures? Reduction in subsidies, transport subsidies, education subsidies. And the poor reacted very strongly. For 3 days, Caracas and its environs were taken over by angry people. 10 days prior to the Caracazo, the president, Perez, had caved in abjectly, going back on promises that he had made before to his own people, for which reason he had been elected. He agreed to implement all the measures demanded by the IMF. And these so-called reforms effectively wrecked his own political career and created a completely new situation in the country. The IMF was not singling out Venezuela for special treatment. This was a policy implemented across the globe, with the exception of the United States, without fear of its victims and with the favor and support of the elite networks that were always the principal beneficiaries. In those early days of neoliberal restructuring, the rhetoric deployed by its pioneers utilized words like progress, trickle-down, modernization, reform, and occasionally even revolution, in order to mask the destruction of the real progress that had been achieved in some areas of everyday life and for a significant minority during the 20th century. To their enormous credit, the poor of Venezuela, without the benefit of advice from renegade intellectuals to the effect that this was a new hegemonic project and as such unchallengeable, understood instinctively what all this was really about. They lost little time in organizing a show of strength against the new government that they had hitherto regarded as their own. They felt betrayed. And, as is often the case in these crises, the people in the streets demonstrated that they were made of sterner stuff and were far more clear-eyed than their political leaders. Within a few hours, the anger that had lit the streets in Guarenas began to infect large swathes of metropolitan Caracas. It triggered off a series of embryonic uprisings in Caracua, La Guara, Maracay, Valencia, Barquisimeto, Guiana, Merida, and Maracaibo. What the government at the time feared the most was that the revolt might affect the flow of oil. But instead of offering concessions, especially on the contentious issue of public transport subsidies and the price of gasoline, the regime opted for a fatal choice. On 28th of February 1989, Carlos Andrés Pérez declared a state of emergency, suspended all the clauses in the Constitution relating to civil liberties. And by the way, not a whisper of protest in the American press or from American politicians. All public assemblies were banned. The Venezuelan military was put in control. Their first act was to impose a 12-hour curfew which compelled citizens to stay at home from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Over the next 4 weeks, the generals ordered the soldiery, in most cases fresh recruits between the ages of 17 and 20, to assault the poor neighborhoods, inspire fear through acts of terror, and if necessary, shoot to kill. Plan Avila, a set of measures prepared in the 60s to deal with the armed struggle factions in the countryside, was now put into action against an unarmed urban population. The massacres that followed led, according to unofficial estimates, to the loss of 3,000 lives, including those of many women and children, and in some cases the dead lay on sidewalks outside their dwellings where the bullets had found them. The global response was muted. It had not yet become fashionable to describe a massacre as genocide and threaten humanitarian intervention. How could a massacre carried out to further the cause of neoliberal capitalism be anything more than conservative rioters resisting reforms firmly dealt with to preserve law and order? The government admitted to only 276 dead without providing any figures for injured or disappeared. Two NGOs that carried out investigations on the spot, as well as international experts, agreed that most of the deaths were due to indiscriminate fire by agents of the Venezuelan state, while others resulted from extrajudicial executions. They also agreed that the members of the armed forces opened fire against crowds and against homes, which caused the death of many children and innocent people who were not taking part in any acts whatsoever. It was this that created unrest inside the army, and it is now, of course, well known that a group of young officers led by Hugo Chavez, decided to meet clandestinely inside the armed forces and decide that they would never tolerate the military being ordered by politicians and the IMF effectively to fire on its own citizens, arguing for a different form of life. This created Bolivarianism. The seeds were sown on the streets of Caracas, and that is what explains the overwhelming support that Hugo Chavez and his successors have received from the poorest of the poor in Venezuela, whose conditions of life would never have improved had the IMF prescriptions been followed. But no lessons were learned, and Argentina was the next to go. Popular protests erupted on the streets of Argentina through the hot December nights of 2001. Crowds from the shanty towns attacked stores, supermarkets, bank pots and pans. The middle classes came out to fight for their rights. Why? Because Argentina had been a country in hock to the World Bank and the IMF and the US Treasury Department. For more than a decade, the Argentinian government had carried out instructions coming from this troika and hoping that the country would benefit. Finally, the banks collapsed, and the trigger was the IMF's suspension of loans to Argentina on the grounds that President Fernando de la Rua's government had failed to meet the conditions on public spending cuts. The result was a disaster, a run on the banks, depositors rushed to get their money out, and their pesos converted into dollars. The economics minister slapped a corralito, a little fence to limit the amount of cash that could be withdrawn, leaving the savings of numerous people trapped in failing banks. The protests intensified. The president had to resign, his helicopter roaring up over the Rosada Palace with clouds of tear gas below. The fall of this president was the first of many. Over the next 10 days, as many as 3 or 4 acting presidents fell. And these unscheduled changes of government in Argentina's history did not result in a military coup, mercifully. The country went through 5 nominal heads of state in 10 days. What happened? Nothing happened from the state. The people took over. Popular assemblies in different parts of the country. The economic crisis could not be blamed on a malfunctioning state. The reason it was malfunctioning was because it was carrying out US instructions. And ultimately, the government abandoned the fixed exchange rate of 1 peso to the dollar, to which the previous president had clung. The currency collapsed before stabilizing around 360 pesos. With the IMF and other institutions refusing to come to the help of Argentina, the government formally repudiated the country's debt, totaling over $130 billion. It was the biggest default in history. The GDP fell by a record 16.3% in the first quarter of 2002, and manufacturing output dropped by 20%. Argentina has a population of 37 million people. 52%, 19 million, fell below the official poverty line, while 20%, 7.5 million, could no longer afford sufficient food. There were reports of children starving in the impoverished rural province of Tucumán. Unemployment soared to 23% of the workforce, with a further 22% underemployed. And so it went on. Ultimately, new elections produced leaders who decided to take the economy by the scruff of its neck and reverse their fortunes. And through a whole set of measures, all of which went against the prescriptions of the IMF, Argentina slowly began to recover, till under Nestor Kirchner and later Cristina Kirchner, the economy had reached a normal level. It wasn't great, but people had memories of what had happened before. And so it was that the IMF's attempt to wreck Venezuela failed. It succeeded in Argentina with disastrous results till its prescriptions were no longer taken seriously. But it carries on in other parts of the world. Nothing much has changed. Critics are attacked. The mild criticisms of Joseph Stiglitz, formerly of the World Bank, Nobel Prize-winning economist, saying that the IMF was guilty of market fundamentalism and refusing to look at alternatives, was denounced. Stiglitz was just his policy prescriptions were not practical. He was an academic. He stayed in five-star hotels when he was working for the World Bank, etc., etc. Petty, trivial responses to a criticism which, while weak, at least attempted to open and start a debate. So where is all this going to end? The fact is that, possibly with the exception of China, the only country that appears to have benefited unambiguously from the trend towards open markets, privatization, deregulation worldwide, is the United States, where a huge inflow of capital has helped allow Americans to spend more than they save and to import more than they export. The trend of globalization is that surplus capital moves away from the peripheral countries to the center, which is the United States. This was the opinion of George Soros in 2002. He'd come to Monterey to persuade financial and political leaders to back his idea of creating a $27 billion pool to finance development, especially when private capital flows dry up. He said, "The US government view is that markets are always right." Soros continued, "My view is that markets are almost always wrong and they have to be made right. Globalization proves disappointing," he was quoted as saying in the New York Times in March 2002. A second and in part related reason for the crisis of the development project was that economic growth was doing little to alleviate poverty in the third world. The development project of the 60s and 70s had led to the president of the World Bank, Robert McNamara, admitting as far back as 1970 that even the attainment of high rates of growth of GNP in low-income countries left, and I quote, infant mortality high, life expectancy low, illiteracy widespread, unemployment endemic and growing, and the distribution of income and wealth severely skewed. These were the words of Robert McNamara. So, if we are now confronted with a situation where the development project also failed, and the neoliberal project has now failed not only the African continent, South America, large swathes of Asia, but has also failed the United States itself, which is how we can understand the 2008 crisis, the International Monetary Fund, which, if the United States had not been the United States, would have sent its teams in and said, do this, do that, cut this spending, that spending, no stimuluses, etc. But the United States, being the only truly sovereign state of the Western world, does not accept any of these prescriptions from anyone. They do what they need to do in order to preserve their country as they see best. And of course, they're not doing a good job. But the fact is that the IMF and its policies have failed completely. All that is taking place now is sticking plaster is being put to cover up the wounds of the 2008 recession. No structural changes are taking place which might prevent such a thing from happening again. And the world watches bemused. In Europe and North America, people feel that there is no other alternative, which makes them powerless and helpless, and they have to then do what? Wait and see. The only continent where people have taken to the streets is, as I've pointed out earlier, South America, Argentina, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil to a certain extent, and they keep trying. In India, the situation, which is painted in bright colors, is actually quite gloomy. And in China, where there has been huge economic growth, it has come at the expense of social benefits to the poor. So the creation of a new bourgeoisie and a huge upper middle class in China has also created a country where wage and salary differentials are today the highest in the world. Clearly, this is a situation which cannot last permanently. It will explode. It has created a new disorder in the world today, and the alternatives are not visible so far in the countries most deeply affected by these disparities and inequalities. They will come, alternatives, and they will come in different ways in different countries. But one thing is clear, that the solutions are not going to be supplied by the European Central Bank or the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. And by the way, a word of warning, the successor to Dominique Strauss-Kahn was Christine Lagarde, a conservative member of Sarkozy's cabinet in France, who was immediately sent to Washington, D.C. to replace him. But she is also currently being investigated for some degree of involvement in a huge bribery and corruption scandal. Fingers crossed.